Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sustainable LatAm, a podcast that focuses on the geopolitical, economic, and social trends in Latin America. With me, as always, I have Andrew Thompson, international journalist and specialized in all what is international current affairs, and Julian Seitu, who is an economic and financial analyst, also specialized in the region in Latin America. My friends, welcome. Today, we're going to focus on Central America and all the changes going in that region. Not an easy task, as we all know. It's 6 countries, we have to look at it, and sometimes with 40, 50 minutes, it's not enough time. But we're doing our best to give the best analysis on that. Let's make a little summary of what is going on. On the political level, obviously, Central America is, like the rest of Latin America, going to a shift towards the right, especially the populist right. We have present elections both in Honduras and Costa Rica, with triumph of the conservatism in Honduras and the populist right in Costa Rica, with President Laura Fernandez just recently in February. That implies basically consolidation of their right-wing policies in Costa Rica, and probably a strong approach towards Trumpism in Honduras as well. I think this change to the right has also a main source that is a concern on security and the drug gang violence that has been affecting the whole region. Costa Rica is a clear example. Violent drug crime has increased in the country in the recent years, and especially at local level, which in a country that was also known as being a safe haven or a quiet place like Costa Rica is a big change going on that. Also, there is the problems with corruption, institutional corruption, that has been affecting the whole region. And obviously, there is some kind of tiredness against the incumbent government and looking for change in the region as well. That's historical in Central America. And then we have, obviously, the geopolitical game that is happening between China and the US, and how it's affecting the region. Both countries are making their movements going around that. And the region is playing between these two big powers who are looking for influence in the region. And finally, we have some economic impact, especially with the upcoming of artificial intelligence that is threatening one of the main sources of economic incomes in the region, which are the call centers, especially in the northern part of the country, like Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, and also offering opportunities in the southern part, like Costa Rica, but also giving challenges towards it. So this is a little bit the scenario that we have. Through this, especially in the area of the violence, there is now a recent event that is with the death of the leader of the Guanajuato cartel, new generation, Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes, alias El Mencho. That has obviously implications for Central America. Mexico is not part of our analysis today. It's going to be part of another analysis that we're going to do in the future. But the killing of El Mencho in Mexico has a direct implications for Central America out there. And with that, let's begin with our conversations. Andrew, what is your view of what is happening, especially in the light of the death of El Mencho? What are the implications for Central America?
I think there are significant implications, and if you like, the headline will be a potential increase of violence in a number of the Central American countries that we're looking at. El Mencho was the leader of one of the most powerful cartels in the Western Hemisphere, and some would go on as far as saying that is one of the biggest criminal groups in the world. So what happens to his organization, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, is very, very important. A key thing to bear in mind is that in the drugs business, like any other business, there is a value chain. There is a system of relationships in which the illicit drugs get produced, distributed, and sold on retail outlets throughout the United States, Europe, and other more developed countries. So the fact, what will be likely happening in Mexico, is that as a result of his departure, there will be a potential struggle within the organization to control the leadership and to control the big operation. History tells us that those struggles often continue for years. Since the arrest of El Chapo Guzman, the head of the Sinaloa cartel, there have been fights among his children for control of the organization, and there has been a lot of violence in Sinaloa itself. Now, that effect doesn't stop once you get to the Mexican frontier with Central America, because Central America is part of the value chain, particularly for the trafficking of drugs. So it is likely that what always happens is big, powerful cartels, like the Mexican cartels, have their local affiliates with different names and so on, but who are doing the trafficking required to get the drugs into the United States. So I think we can look across Central America and, of course, to countries outside Central America that play an important role, such as Ecuador. We'll be looking at greater violence and a period of some chaos within organized crime.
Thanks, Andrew. First of all, thanks for correcting me. It's the Jalisco Cartel Nueva Generacion, not Guanajuato, so it's good to know that. Julian, from an economic perspective, obviously you're an investor on this, and drug trafficking is one of the main problems in Central America that probably affect, especially direct investment. What can you see on this? Is going to be affected, or can we expect also on political terms here? We have now the Bukele Effect in Salvador, so a hard response to crime. Can we expect this is going to go all across the region in order to try to give some positive answer for direct investment? What is your views on that?
Well, so a cold analysis would actually say that there's not so much drugs trade that have a negative impact. The problem is really related to the externalities of drug trades, and specifically in this context, and as Andrew mentioned, increased violence across whether it's Mexico or across Central America. That's the big danger with it. Is that as it was mentioned, the value chain is particularly important. New relationships need to be made. Possibly, people want to certainty because we are talking about in narco economics are in the billions. It's a multi-billion-dollar trades that depend on this. So when you have just a pass-through moment and people do their bit, so something comes at the airport, someone is given their left and right, then actually, it's like any other business in a certain sense that, value has been created and it's been left over at these economies. So it does create wealth within the economies that are participating in this trade. But it's on the negative externalities that you see the real danger. And of course, when you have the head of the cartel who's being was shot down, that creates instability, like in any other business, and we see in normal, in more normal businesses, when you have the head of the CEO of a big company immediately the markets react in the same way here people will react quite violently. And that creates volatility. Of course, everything's in question. So I would say that in the short term, the volatility is there until we understand, what's the new game, who's in power, who's been, what's the follow up of this. Right now, it seems that the understanding that I'm getting from within the news is that this was a Mexican operation, which was to some extent backed by U.S. intelligence. And for us, we come back to the Donnery doctrine, is that to what extent does it extend to other countries? And when we come back to talk about Costa Rica, I assume for the latest elections, and the move towards the right, and which is linked to security and so on, will we see increased corporations from the US there will increase presence in that part of the world, and that will in itself create possibly more chaos initially, because people will start becoming more nervous. To what extent is the DEA across all other parts of Central America?
Andrew, go ahead.
I wanted to jump in there. I studied economics at university. I wasn't a very good student, but one thing stuck with me, and it's quite helpful, I think, when looking at the drug trade. And the concept is inelastic demand. And as I understood it, if you have elastic demand, the price goes up and you buy much less because the price has gone up. But if you have inelastic demand, you buy whatever the price is because you need the product in such an intense way. And the key problem is that the United States, which is the main center of drug consumption, has an inelastic demand approach. It will take drugs, the US market will take drugs at almost whatever price they're put at, because fueling this, it's an addiction. So the key issue for me is that even if you take out El Mencho and other gang leaders, demand creates its own supply. The inelastic demand for drugs means that there will be new El Menchos and new gangs will fill the gap. And the way to try and tackle that is to reduce drug consumption, something that Donald Trump has not spoken about very much. But I would go as far as saying until US drug consumption is reduced in some meaningful way, the Central American countries will be condemned to these cycles of violence that prevents their economies developing and prevents key things happening like poverty reduction.
It is true. But on the other side, from what Julian was saying in geopolitical terms, because I agree with you that there is this inelastic demand, and we're going to see the problem is going to continue. But on the other side, we see the pressure of the U.S. at regional level and the Central American, the collaborations. We can see, for example, just following the news, I think 2 or 3 days ago, El Salvador has a huge operation. They basically putting down a drug trafficking operation in their coast in collaboration with Mexico. Behind this is the U.S. Because of the death of El Mencho, Guatemala has increased its military presence in the borders with Mexico in order to stop basically the flow of people of the Jalisco Cartel getting away from Mexico after what happened. And Costa Rica has increased its migration controls in the airports in collaboration with the U.S. So I think we're going to see more of this, especially in the short terms, and U.S. intelligence behind all of this operation in that way. As you say, is going to sort it out the problem. I think in the last 30 years, we have been seeing the same operations going away. So we will see what is happening, but definitely. Let's change a little bit the line, go with more political terms. Let's talk about elections now. We have had two important elections.
I just want
Go
to
ahead,
say,
Fiona.
it's actually, I think, I don't think we won't talk. I don't think we need to do a full podcast here on this, but I think there's when you think about, if I think about competition and movements, the cartels were all competing, the productions, from various countries who are competing, the trade routes who are competing, and so on. Is that this is one of many, and what usually happens, it's someone started something somewhere. Now I don't, as you just said, then this route has been taken several times before. For the but we need to remember also that now there's something going on in the state, and we just don't know why. I don't really understand what is the impulse at this stage for subduing either the cartels or going after specific people and so on. And so we need to think really carefully about who the value, when things are moving this way, value goes somewhere. Someone captures more or less of the value in the supply chain. And if it's the US who's reasserting itself altogether, and if I think just strictly in economics term, it could be simply that people in the US want to capture more of the value of the whatever goes into their shores, whatever form that takes in. So I think this something deeper is going on here, and we may see there'll be much more in that respect that will start emerging as things are being deployed, as the US takes a deeper approach, as the politics of certain countries take a right, mano dura approach as well. And so I think it goes deeper here. I don't know what it is. It's just a sense, and a sense that there's more to it.
Andrew, what's your view? Because it's really interesting. I think there is a deeper approach as well. That's why I was trying to go with the political and economic terms as well. But what is your view? What do you think is behind all of this? Because it is true, we are having seen this for many years, but why now this strength of the mano dura going around?
Yeah. I think one angle I'd take on it is that a lot of politics is theater, and a lot of it is striking a position, taking a pose, and trying to be consistent with that. And ultimately, it's about votes. So I think if we look at Donald Trump, from way back the campaign for his first presidency, he decided to speak ill of Mexicans, basically, as a way of rallying nationalist sentiment, and ultimately as a way of winning the elections, as you appeal to the voters with a fairly simple message. I think the thing about crime, corruption, and violence is that it is very widespread and very difficult to measure success or failure. So to give you an example, which I think we've mentioned before in conversations, one of the ways of measuring crime is by the number of homicides every year per 100,000 members of the population. And if you go back 3 years, El Salvador was one of the most violent countries on earth, because it had a homicide to 100,000 ratio of over 100. Bukele's great success has been to reduce that to almost zero. And in fact, I have the figures quite close by. The current El Salvador homicide rate is 1.9 per 100,000, whereas you look at Panama, it's 12.9. You look at Guatemala, it's 16.6. You look at Honduras, it's 25.3. And what has happened is that El Salvador, on paper at least, has made major achievement in pacifying the country. There are doubts. The figures are somewhat manipulated. They exclude bodies found in mass graves. They exclude people killed in clashes with the armed forces. So it's been massaged. But there's no doubt, I think you have to admit, that the average Salvadorian feels safer now than he or she did 2 or 3 years ago. And of course, the president has made a political career out of mano dura, and he goes to Washington, and he's a great friend of Donald Trump's, and they both talk about mano dura, how successful it is. But just to add to the complication of this, there are examples, and Mexico is one of the strongest, where militarizing the approach to crime and adopting a mano dura has been a fairly obvious failure, in the extent that Mexico began militarizing its response to the criminal cartels in 2006, and 20 years have passed. So it's true that the homicide rates have fallen a bit, but over those 20 years, successive presidents have said, I'm going to solve the problem of crime, and every time they've failed.
That's interesting, what you mentioned. As Julian said, and we said, we want to do a more deeper analysis of Mexico in future episodes. But just thinking in Central America and what you're mentioning about the Bukele effect or the political of mano dura in El Salvador, one thing that comes to my mind, and I think we have to think in that way, that the kind of violence that Bukele attack in El Salvador, there is a particularity in this, that there were the local gangs that have territorial control among the young former guerrilla and going around that. I'm not sure how strong was, obviously there is a link with drug trafficking around that, but it's more a territorial control, and like the state has put a stronger presence around, that could be like a success. But in a situation like we have today with drug trafficking, that is a real problem with permitting, and it's a more than international enterprise going around that goes beyond Mexico, beyond Central America. It's a global operation going around there. How successful can be the mano dura? As you say, Mexico try in a way with a different kind of violence, that is the drug crime policies that were going to, with the drug cartels. How effective can be the states in Central America using a Bukele approach? We are seeing that Costa Rica is trying to do it now with the big prisons. Honduras is going to do estado de excepción. Guatemala has estado de excepción as well, exceptional state. But how much control do we have, or are we going to see some kind of failure in the future? That's a big question that's going around that. And on economic terms, definitely for El Salvador, that success, especially on the papers, and Julian, you can correct me, is an incentive for investment in the future, because you are creating a different kind of scenario. But if we have this variable of the drug violence going around, especially at the local level with the different elements, how can we see this now? It's really an uncertain future in the region. Am I right?
Yeah, well, I think you're again, I think when you have competing factors that look for value, capture value somewhere, this is when things get violent, and particularly in even normal businesses, things can get awkward. so when we go into drugs, which has huge margins, and it's as you said, has huge demand and so on. Of course, this creates even more problems, instability, and again, I think this is Yeah, I think this is actually quite concerning for that part of for Central America altogether. It starts in Mexico, but it just will go down and south of the borders and further down and further down. So every choke point or every point already are questionable. Again, I would take the concept of value capture. The concept of value capture here is in the same way that for you had the example of Maduro. Maduro was accused of they were basically bombing ships that were going out to Venezuela, supposedly transporting drugs to other parts. Whether it's true or not, that's the year's version was that it was. That was a way to deal with someone, and he said he was head of some cartel, I can't remember the name, Soles or whatever it was, and then they just took him out. So they cut off the head, and then they let the next people take power, and regardless of whether it's a democratic government or whatever, it's no longer the game. The game is we want control. So they cut off the head, and what happened to Mexico can be akin to the same way. They just cut off the head, and now new people will come to. There will be, probably violence about, or someone is going to emerge of it. Maybe it's known. We know about the politicians, about Maduro and all the rest. Before the underworld, it's a lot less known. Some people will know about who comes up next, and maybe that's also a signal. And then who else? Who is next in this control and this controlling version? And again, it's also about for me is a capture of value from the US. We're saying, America first. We want to capture things. And if you think about this, they have a militia operating, the best funded militia in the world, called ICE, across the US, who's basically responding and going after anyone who's deemed to be an illegal alien, which can lead to protests. Of course, on the other side, there's protests everywhere. But on the other side, in terms of security, weapon, and control a security state, it's a very effective manner to just disrupt any kind, or take control of any kind of trade that may be going on US soil, because you can just send into one area really, really weaponized people who seem to be, outside, operating in a different sphere, and they're not constrained by some of the other unusual forces that you have. And then in itself, that creates disruption there. Then you cut off the head of one of the head in Mexico. Then further down in you send a strong message in Venezuela. If you follow the line, what comes next? Is it in between in Central America, or do you go further down and towards Colombia and even further down, etc.? So I think this is a really, I think it's again, in terms of value capture, there's something going on here. It's about the control. It's about so it calls, let alone the voters, that's what they want, because security, it creates problems for people are scared and whatever. But just purely in terms of monetary value, there's more value. There was these images about Trump's envoy in Venezuela. Was the new person coming, looking at the oil fields and whatever. So again, control, value capture. What's happening in Mexico? There's something's happened. U.S. intelligence was involved, and U.S. intelligence was involved also in Venezuela. U.S. intelligence is involved there. Where else is there going to be some similar thing? Cut off the head of something, and then the value capture. Are deals being made elsewhere? That creates stability, but it also creates people who will think about these implications. If I'm, and then I can't remember who's which there was this saying in Bolivia, ni confren tu camisa.
That's not even in our shirt.
Yes. So you will get this mentality
across the thing, and that creates itself, in something a psychological factor for a lot of people. In across.
I think, if I can just jump in, I think one of the problems is that crime and understanding crime is really, really complicated. And it's one of these things, there's no magic bullet. You can't just do one thing and it's solved. In fact, there are all sorts of things. There's how you run the prisons. That's how good your criminal justice system is. There are all sorts of issues in play. But I'd come back a bit to this idea that a lot of what politicians do is performative. It's it sounds a strange distinction to be made. It's not about fighting crime. It's about looking good fighting crime, adopting a stance which the voter can identify with, and thinks good. And I think we've seen many cases that, for example, the previous Mexican president would ignore bad statistics. The journalists would say, but this and this and this has happened. And this Manuel López Obrador would say, yo tengo otros datos. I have other data, which is his way of saying, I don't actually have other data, but I'm going to ignore what you're saying. And of course, notoriously, Trump is very, very good at doing that. If I'm correct.
Trump is also very good at capturing at business. If he's thinking
capturing the value,
capturing value, we can see it across every action that has been taken around the world. Whether it's in Ukraine, deals on the about who's going to own what, whether it's in Gaza, who's going to own what, whether it's I think this is an unusual. This is not politics as usual, and as we start to witness. But
just to give you an example, would you think that crime rates in the United States have been rising or falling? And the answer is they've been falling quite significantly, which Trump, of course, totally ignores because it doesn't really fit with his political stance. There's also, it's hard to find the correct, reliable statistics, but there are some statistics which I believe are from Texas, which show that resident U.S. citizens commit more crimes than immigrant Mexicans in the same state. So, I mean, crime is without a doubt incredibly important and damaging thing, but I do think there is some political manipulation of crime figures to favor the new right.
Absolutely. So I think you're completely right there. We see it. Same. I think you're right. I mean, yes, the data is there to show that crime is going down. But for me, in my cynical view of how things are being played out, all I see is intent of value capture somewhere, be it by the US first, and everything seems to be we see it across the thing, and if it happened once or twice, you may think, okay, it's part of it's this and that, but actually something is going on there.
I think there are two elements here when I listen to you both, and I think it's important to look in the cynical elements. Obviously, we are here at a game of control, economic control, political control, geopolitical control, and we're seeing that in elements. Also, as Andrew says, you have to, in a way, accompany all these movements that we are still trying to understand what is going on with political persuasion and manipulation of data and using that. That's for sure. And a natural feeling of the local populations, especially when we're speaking in Central America, of the need to be safe. We cannot forget this region has a historical rate of violence from the guerrillas, drug trafficking, crime, corruption, a lot of it. The populations are looking for answers towards this. And the politicians have been giving this, and that has played really well in the Town Road doctrine and Trump's doctrine as well. in the way of control. Now, that's one element of going in international. There's another player here in international politics, and I would like to analyze in that. We have on one side the US trying to assert control. The other player is China. And a lot of what we're seeing, a little bit, is a competition China-US as well. I will go to another country in the region that has a different element, but you can see this competition more strongly, Panama, and the control of the channel in that case. It just recently, 2 days ago, the state has taken over control of the two sides of the ports in the channel. That's geopolitical game. But also, we can add crime, all the elements going around that. But there's also this reinforcing this view of Julian. If we're going to show the bigger, there is a control power for control in certain elements. And we can see that. How is this other player react? It's really interesting to see what is China going to do, because so far has been working with infrastructure, building a lot of infrastructure in Central America. Yeah. But this competition is going to increase, or are we seeing really the reasserting of the US power in the region? Or I will be a little bit controversial, and Andrea, I ask you, is the US in the offensive, or is the US on the defensive when we're seeing all these geopolitical games?
That's a really difficult question. I think it is formally on the offensive, but it is, if we're talking in military terms, it's got a front line and things are happening at the front line, but behind the front line, there is less logistics and supplies and reinforcement than we would think. So what I'm saying is that the Trump administration is posturing quite aggressively, but it's not quite clear if it will follow that up with, to give an example, infrastructure investment. China has been making a lot of infrastructure investment around Central America and Latin America as a whole. The United States say this is terrible, and people who are dealing with China, we're going to remove their visa privileges, we're going to take harsh action. But it's not coming up with its own offer of financial help to build major, much-needed projects. So it seems to be that if you're a Latin American or Central American government and you have a really big bridge you want built, if you go to the US, they'll sort of agree in general and say you should kind of get closer to them politically, but they won't actually fund and build the bridge. The Chinese will do that, and the Chinese will say, falsely, in my opinion, they will say, we are completely apolitical. We have no political interest. We'll just give you the money and the expertise, and you've got to give it to our contracting company rather than any other rival. But the Chinese are selling themselves as impartial friends of Latin America, and that, if that's some political posturing, it's quite effective, because a lot of Latin American countries prefer not to have any strings to the money they're getting, any conditions on it.
Julian, we spoke this a lot in the past, but sounds like an opportunity for any government in Latin America, this competition, because you play a little bit the game. It says, okay, if you are bad with me, I'm going to go to the other side. It's an opportunity, and on the other side, how do you see this competition, especially in Central America?
Yeah. Well, I think for Central America, it's quite difficult. The closer you are to the US, and the more you are likely to face US action in nearby, as we saw recently. So. Before, of course, compete with you send your people, you compete, you build infrastructure, you take control of the electric grid, you promote 5G across, you provide them with cheap things, and so there's various ways to offer competition that arises from when you deal with China, and it comes at all levels. So this will be still there. But for them, if they can sell and build all the, in a way, having the infrastructure or controlling the electric grid or controlling the water pipes or controlling internet access is a control way as well, so that you partake in these things. It's also interesting. I come back to the Costa Rica example, but it's interesting that you do have these agreements for some of these countries with the EU as well. We have this pact, this EU Central America agreement in place. So again, we have several players that are operating in the region, and of course, but at this present moment, as you go towards right-leaning governments, towards a more active U.S. government across the region, if you are a competing power right now, you probably want to keep low profile for the time being. And if you've made your investment, you've made your investments. Now you control part of the various infrastructure that we described, and you just wait and see what's happening, because there are some elections coming up, and there's these various competing factors within the US at this present moment. The Chinese don't have this issue about thinking who's come next. There's an agreement, there's an alignment across things, to some extent, but then also they have their internal factions control. So but right now it's probably a longer term approach, and they can just sit and wait for the next election cycle to start and see for that particular for those particular countries in Central America.
Just one data to add on all of this. I'm going to go to Panama and to understand sometimes how China reacts or act, and in this control towards infrastructure that you're saying. It's really interesting with the seize of the ports from the Panama states, taking away Hong Kong and China, especially around that. China doesn't react quietly in that area. Has already threatened with a lot of international actions. That's a little bit the gameplay. But what is really interesting on all of this is has stopped a lot of infrastructure projects in Panama, especially I think that the 4 bridges towards the channel that are billions of dollars at stake. So it's a way how China is putting its own pressure as well in the different controls. And going on the game, as you say, the role of Europe, it's really interesting that the Panama government has given the control of the ports to 2 European companies, not American companies, which is really something to look towards the future. I will go a little bit now in terms of the economic thinking in the future.
I just want to jump on the Panama control. I think this is a really interesting case study, right? Because the way that it started is effectively basically Trump said this needs to be America's.
Exactly.
So there was the initial approach was let's get some private players to go in and make an offer that is a good offer, possibly to the owner or to the operator, who's a well-known Hong Kong group, well-known figures there, and is run by a patriarch. Again, one man to two a few people meet around the rooms, come up with a deal. The Hong Kong, the Hongkongese, saw this coming, understood that this was not just a friendly offer, saw there's value to be made, and effectively agreed, let's do the deal, and we did a deal. then China intervened and said, sent a message to the Hong Kongese and said, if I were you, I would not do the deal, kind of thing. At a moment when in China and was asserting control in a similar way to Hong Kong, and you had over the past 10 years, you had increasing interference. You had state security from mainland going to Hong Kong and taking people out of Hong Kong into mainland China, and so in a similar way, that was implicitly possibly the message that was passed across to the Chinese operator, to the Hong Kongese operator. The Hong Kongese operator then said, "Actually, I don't want to do the deal." And now what's happening is that the soft approach, or say value, has changed completely. Yeah.
Andrew, go ahead.
I wanted to jump in because there is something really important here. It's a bit of a side issue, but it's one that we need to watch. Essentially, we're talking about a swing to the right across Latin America, and that in principle would seem to mean that there are more governments wanting to get close to the Donald Trump administration in the White House. But I think what Panama tells us is that if you are a small country in the Western Hemisphere, your alliance with the United States is not very reliable, because in Panama, Mulino, the president, is a conservative, but he cannot move closer to the United States. He's not really been allowed to because the US won the canal, and that is not something any Panamanian politician can give up, because there is a long and strong nationalist tradition. And it seems to me that we should bear this in mind as we look at how regional politics develop during the course of this year, 2026, because while there may be more right-wing nationalist governments, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will work smoothly with the United States, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there might be conflicts among different right-wing governments over all sorts of issues. I mean, we've seen Ecuador has been applying some tariffs in a very Trumpian kind of way that would affect some of its neighbors. And if you like, the politics as usual will grind on, and there will be conflicts within the wider MAGA movement.
I agree.
Yeah.
We'll see. I will. There is a shift towards the right, a populist right, more Trumpian friend in many ways, but it's ambiguous. And for me, one of the great examples is in El Salvador, Bukele. Bukele is probably one of the closest friends of Trump, but he's not shy to accept Chinese investment like the big library or other.
Yeah.
And we can see this game. So it's not a black and white game here. We're about to see a lot of grays.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But on the other side, I shouldn't say something is going on. And I think that the Don't Roll doctrine and the Trump policies towards the region is heading somewhere. We are still trying to understand this. I'm pretty sure Trump knows where he wants to go, because we cannot ignore that. But definitely there is a change, and there is a huge geopolitical competition towards there. Yeah. One of the elements we have to talk a lot is probably the U.S. trying, both in Central America and Latin America in general, to have some control to certain natural resources that is going to help their artificial intelligence economy going around that. And they try to control this strongly. And obviously there is the competition with China, again, through the new economies and going around that. But we can see that. But now that I mentioned artificial intelligence, and talking about Central America specifically, it's really interesting for me and amazing to see how challenging is the future for Central America in economic and political terms, because artificial intelligence, just giving an example, is the most disruptive technology going in place. And it's going to impact a lot in Central America, especially in the north, where the call centers are going to disappear literally because of this competition. And I think this is going to add more pressure to Central American governments on social, political, and also economic terms. And obviously, we can see more probably young generations going towards crime if something is not done. There's also opportunities. We see Costa Rica is playing a lot of it, becoming a data center for the Americans, but has also the challenge that a lot of its engineers, a lot are being recruited by the U.S. companies. So we have fuga de cerebros, brain drain.
Brain drain.
Yeah. But here is the question. It's really an uncertain future here. What can else expect? And I'm trying to end because we are close to the podcast time now. But perhaps we have to see with the question that normally you love to do this, Andrew. In 5 years, towards 2030, how are we going to see Central America with all these variables going around that? And I'm going to begin with you, Andrew. How do you see Central America in 2030?
I think it'll be mixed. At the moment, there are we've been talking about 6 Central American countries with different political and economic, if you like, configurations. I think what we can say is that those countries that have made most economic progress within the 6, which are basically Panama and Costa Rica, will be doing well, but they will be hit by artificial intelligence, and they will, some jobs will disappear, others will appear. There may be a bit more small enterprise and startups, which might lead to expansion in technology and things of that kind on a fairly small basis. If we look at the other end in economic terms, the less wealthy countries are without a doubt El Salvador and Honduras. So it will be difficult for them. And it'll be interesting to watch again Bukele, because Bukele is a fan of new technology and of artificial intelligence. But he will be in a country where reaping the value of that trend will be most difficult. And then, of course, there's Nicaragua, which is an old-fashioned 2-person dictatorship, which has very, very high levels of poverty and low levels of development. So trying to pull this together and get to 2030, I think Panama and Costa Rica will be doing better, but they will still have big problems to resolve.
Julian, your view of a 2030 Central America?
I don't know, it's difficult. The service sector dominates in the richer countries now, and as we just mentioned, AI is going to disrupt. So there's a lot of support services to the US and Europe or other economies. So AI is going to disrupt this quite extensively. Maybe the way to deal with it is for higher value jobs. So education will need to be spread strong, a bigger part in it. But given that in some in Panama or Costa Rica, for instance, the service sector is 70%, 80% of GDP. There's a lot of questions there. Of course, if you are a hub there because you are of your location, some of it is stable because you made a hub. As we see, there's already competition for this. But yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge with the next couple of years, and 2030 is a long time, and it all depends again on in large part about what happens in the US. I'm personally not very positive about the US economy, and so that's the challenging that will bring in addition to AI and to military things, I think that's another that's going to be a challenging time for these countries, especially if there's more violent conflict across the subcontinent.
Yeah, with this, I think my take on the 2030 is a little bit similar to both of you. So I'm explaining. It's going to be challenging, very challenging for the region. All problems like migration, violence, I think actually we are at risk of being exacerbation because of the disruptions of new technologies like artificial intelligence. Opportunities are arising. It depends how it's going to be dealt in the future, but definitely is very uncertain to say. And towards this, we're going to see this increasing geopolitical competition and economic competition that the region is part of it. And like Julian, I am also not very optimistic of the U.S. economy in the future, and I think this is going to have implications for the region. With this, unless you want to jump and say anything else, I think we are at the end of our time in the podcast. I would say, as always, it's a real pleasure talking with you guys and looking in the future. As we mentioned, we are going to talk very soon, probably, about the Mexican situation and also more about the U.S. and geopolitical competition in the whole Latin America. That's future episodes of our podcast, and a lot is going on. I invite all of you to continue with us. We're going to have also more special guests in the future with all the games, Mexico, Brazil. There is, and I think you both agree with me, really more than interesting, exciting time to analyze Latin America.
Yep.
So with this, I say thank you very much, and until the next time.